Hello, everyone, and welcome to Writers Drinking Coffee. This is a podcast where writers sit around drinking tasty beverages and talk about writing, publishing, and the whole creative process. There will be rants and raves and opinions that do not agree but are lovingly delivered. We will not censor ourselves, so consider us PG-13. Today, Chaz is sick and John is working hard on an election campaign for a friend, so it's just you and me, Jeannie Warner, and Jonathan R. Rose. This is episode 162. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here. Looking forward to a nice chat.
I'm delighted that you reached out to us. I heard you talking on another podcast, and there's just a topic I wanted to jump right into because with the modern economy and people's things, you talked about how you up and moved to Mexico because you wanted to be a writer and it was cheaper.
Yeah. Well, let's get into it. Yep.
I was going to say rents in Toronto are horrible, and I totally get that. Yep. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we don't even want to talk about how expensive it is here. So you drove to Mexico City and set up a place. Tell us about it.
Well, funny enough, rents, they were high then, but they were nothing like they are now. Now it's just obscene. And again, yeah, when you say you're from San Francisco, oh man, you can feel the pain and I can feel yours. And with that, I think I'm probably going to end up doing it again. Maybe not Mexico, but probably somewhere else.
I hear you. I was going to say, I hear you. I lived in Guelph, Ontario for a year, and it still wasn't cheap there either.
No, and Guelph, the outskirts there, it's just not tenable. Not if you want to. I always view it like it's tenable if you just want to dedicate your life to working to pay that rent and everything. And that is a life I don't want to live and never did.
So do you think that we could see a movement of expatriate writers in other countries? It could be a real thing.
It's actually happening through work I do aside from writing, because just to slide in a little tip, I would love to tell any writer, if you're a writer and you want to write books, that's great, but it's a skill and it can be done for many different things. You can live off writing, if not necessarily book writing. Just a cool little thing I learned over the years.
Well, I moved from operations into marketing, and so I totally get you. I basically write things for a living.
Exactly, same. And so when in the course of research with some work I do for immigration, it's actually legitimate. A lot of even first-time immigrants, they stay for a few years and they're like, I can't afford this, so they leave. Yeah. And a lot of particularly younger people, people in their 20s, which was about the time I left for Mexico, they're leaving because they just can't do it. So there's a brain drain going on throughout Canada, and it is increasing. It's getting quite substantial because the cost of living is just too prohibitive.
Well, should I ask how you ended up back in Canada? Why did you leave Central America?
Well, I left because of the pandemic. That was, I had no intention on leaving. I was going to stay. I was liking my life there. Things are actually moving. There was going to be a book tour for my Spanish book called Gato y Lobo. My life was there, but the pandemic hit like it hit everybody.
Yeah.
And so in March 2020, it was really stressful. I was in Mexico City checking airlines every day, seeing flights get canceled, the whole world basically losing its mind. And my mom, she lives alone here in Canada, and I couldn't leave my mom alone. So I came back and just pretty much to make sure she was okay throughout the whole pandemic.
I think that's actually pretty awesome of you.
Thanks.
You got to look after our moms and dads. That matters.
Of course. And it was a tough call, though. It was one of those things where I won't go totally dramatic and go Sophie's Choice, but it was one of those kind of choices where no matter what I chose, I was going to lose.
It's true.
So, but I made the call. I stick with it. I was really glad to help my mom through it. And now that the pandemic's leaving, I have a feeling I'm just going to repeat my own history and leave again. Because to go back to your initial question, when I left, I was just starting. It was about 13 years ago, give or take. And I said, I want to write. I want to take this seriously. But it's hard to do with like a full-time job and paying rent. I'm like, no, I want to go for it. I'm young. I want to see. And I knew people down in Mexico, and I just wanted to go. I was traveling a lot before that because I worked for an airline. And I didn't want to glimpse countries anymore and cultures. I didn't want to dip my toes in. I wanted to immerse. I wanted to really learn and live in it. So I packed up my old 92 Camry and I have no idea how it made it with close to 280,000 kilometers on it. But I drove down, made it, and I didn't have a plan. Didn't think I would spend a decade. I just said, I'm just going to do this, see what happens. And yeah, 10 years there, 2 years in Argentina. And if not for the pandemic, who knows?
So I almost want to ask, given now I've read a couple one of your books,
Thank
I
you.
want to discuss genre, which you seem to sort of be flirting with dystopia, touch of horror across to all of your different books. How would you
Mhm.
classify yourself, or would you classify yourself?
Painfully cynical. No.
But
uh,
so dystopia then.
um,
I
the,
think a cynic is a person who is struck by the difference between how things are and how they ought to be.
I'd agree. I found it like I like to think more critical versus cynical, but I find cynical is one of those words that has really been molded by people where it has such a brazenly negative connotation that it's almost hard to dig it out of its grave. Where it's just like it doesn't necessarily mean you're negative or a downer. I think it's more just you just don't you refuse to see things through rose-colored glasses. You know what I mean? And
Absolutely. I mean, we could almost have a whole modern what's the word horoscope where
right,
the curmudgeon used to be a romantic but had to form some kind
right.
of shell to protect their gooey insides.
Right. Yeah. Like, yeah. And, or the misanthrope was like somebody people would listen to a little bit. Like I do get it. If you're just going to rant and rave and be redundant and boring with it and just say everything sucks, well, that's one thing. But
Yeah.
what I've always tried to do was explore it. But I was told this by somebody who really knew me, and they actually called me a very hopeful person in the things I've written. And I found that really interesting because I always wanted to entertain that notion that I think I would have truly been negative, where just like, oh, screw it, people suck, life sucks, etc. But in the end, I write these books because I'm trying to explore that negativity rather than brush it off. I want to understand it. I want to expand on it. I want to speculate on it. And then maybe in that speculation and understanding, maybe there's some answers. Maybe there's some, not to say I have the answers, but I'm trying to find them. Like, okay, maybe we're doing all of this stuff wrong. All right, well, what if we change this? Or what if we do this? So I figure, go through the muck and maybe you'll find something there rather than just look at the muck and walk away from it. So I try to take it like that.
Do you consider your writing very story driven or very character driven, or how do you where do you fit in all of that debate?
I think when I started, it was very story driven. It was a very, I would start with what if. I would start with a question. I would start with just kind of like I daydream a lot. It's something I enjoy.
Occupational hazard, I imagine.
Absolutely. I always remember a comedy routine from George Carlin, who, oh, you want to talk about somebody that inspired wordplay and storytelling.
More than somewhat, yes.
Oh man, tremendous influence for me. And just listening to him, and he used to talk about all the time. He's like, everybody should spend at least an hour a day daydreaming. And I always took that to heart because I kind of got it. It was just like, yeah, you just kind of think. I like to take a walk and think. And so when I would do that, I would often come up with stories like, oh, like what if this happened? Like for my first book, called Carry On, it's very violent, but it was done hopefully not gratuitously, but I did it more in the sense of I just wanted to see an apocalyptic monster story through the monster's perspective. That was where it started, really. It was just like, what do the monsters think in The Walking Dead before they get an arrow in the head? Maybe they're thinking about something. Maybe they're just animals looking for food. Maybe they're not evil at all. Like that was curious to me. But
Oh, I saw the funniest two panel cartoon that I have to share with you. One of it
oh,
was,
please do. Okay.
imagine a zombie of a lawyer who's being haunted by his own ghost. Come on, Phil, we were a lawyer. We're better than this.
I'd love to see that. Yes,
Why
please.
not combine the two?
Exactly.
What about all of the ghosts of all George Romero's walking around dead people? I mean,
Hmm.
aren't they upset about it?
Yeah, they're just like, why am I eating my cousin? I liked him.
No, no, run, Joyce, run.
Yeah, like come on, we got along. Or then someone's just like, that's my ex. I'm eating them. Okay, I'm good with that.
Well, I asked this question in particular because in both of the books that I read one of your older ones, The Spirit of Laughter,
Okay,
and your newest patriarch. I'm sorry, your newest song about the patriarchy called Wedlock.
that could be a good subtitle, maybe.
Yes. And it felt like in both of them, they were, in the older one, you had a boy lacking initiative that doesn't quite fit in anywhere. And in
Hmm.
the girl one, you kind of a little bit more developed. You had a woman of initiative, but still
Hmm.
didn't quite fit in anywhere.
Hmm.
Do you sometimes, is that a projection at all, or is that just a tabula rasa to put in your situation that you've dreamt up? Your what if?
Oh, how much would I love to be just like, no, it's just put into my characters, but yep, it's an absolute projection. I might as well cop to it. But I don't think I do it consciously. I don't, because to continue on the earlier question, I find, especially those two books you mentioned, my last two, Spirit of Laughter and Wedlock, they were definitely more character driven. I find that as I'm continuing and growing as a storyteller, I do like focusing more on characters and seeing them develop and stuff like that. And so I think the projection comes in because I simply find people, I find individuals just more interesting. And I've always found the type of person that thinks for themselves or goes against the status quo to just be, there's just so much more options on where that character can go, especially if they're your main protagonist. That, like, if you want to, like, do I want to follow the journey of somebody whose path is going to be utterly predictable from the first sentence? Or do I want to follow the journey of somebody who kind of paves their own way? And I think the concept of projection comes in because I've spent a lot of my life living that way, or tried to, with many obstacles and so many mistakes along the way. But that notion of just, yeah, like I've always prided it on where people ask me, like, where do you see yourself in 5 years? But I don't have the slightest clue, no idea.
You want to be an eccentric author living on a boat moored in a beautiful island paradise?
Isn't it painfully cliche? But at the same
No, no,
time,
it's not. It's beautiful.
I did pack an old car and drove south until the language changed. So I cannot really claim that I'm against it. So
I was almost saying it's not quite the motorcycle diaries, but
no,
how
I
many of
had
us
too
think,
much stuff.
Shay was a little bit too, if that had been how should we say it, a Toyota or a Japanese built car, because let's face it, there's no Ford or Chevy that could have ever done that.
No, well, that's why I went in a Toyota Camry.
Smart,
This was the old ones built like a tank.
smart. I have a Prius and that puppy never dies. It's beautiful.
Yeah. But it's funny you mentioned the Motorcycle Diaries. I read that book maybe a year or two before I went to Mexico. I actually read it in one day. I only had one day. I was in a hostel in Peru, and somebody was like, "Hey, have you heard of this?" I actually never heard of it. It was my early 20s, didn't know. And like, "Yeah, you should read this, but I need to leave in the morning." I'm like, "Okay, I'll read it now." So I just read it overnight before I ventured out, and it definitely hit me. Just the initial, because when he, it's so interesting reading that book, but knowing he wrote it with no idea what he would become. He didn't know he'd become Che Guevara as we know it. He was just a young guy who wanted to explore, and that always resonated with me, and it still does. Stories, even stories like Shantaram, or any of those stories about people that just kind of had these journeys where they had no clue where they'd end up, but they wanted to embark on them. I've always been fascinated by that. So that's
I
probably why I always go back to it.
see. I liked that, and in a way, you did something with the boy in the spirit of laughter that was interesting because, to a certain extent, we as the reader never really get to know them. It's
Mm,
not about his inward journey. It's all that we know is he's kind of a nihilist. you
mm-hmm,
know, if you don't
mm-hmm,
tell me why, I don't care. It seemed to be his thing.
mm-hmm.
But only as fellow students through his stories, and we learn about the faculty through their interaction, you tell the stories of absolutely everybody else. And I wondered if the boy was a metaphor for the writer.
Not directly. I don't. It wasn't something I consciously did. I mean, if that comes across, I always find it really, really interesting when I hear perspectives of things I've written that I never thought of from other people. It's one of the most flattering, but also it's so fascinating because I hear what you're saying. I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. Maybe it was subconsciously. But I do remember the key I wanted from that was he was the type who just kept to himself. He just wanted to get through school and then embark on bigger, better things in his life.
Mm.
And he was more indifferent than he was malicious. It's not, he didn't hate everybody, he just didn't care. And so when he was tasked with the assignment and that he had to get to know them, he had no choice. And I've always liked that idea that he was more reluctant. He didn't want to, but then as he got almost sucked into these stories he's being told, he just felt compelled to act and to continue. And I always found that to be an interesting idea. That I never liked the idea of the eager hero. I don't buy it. It's corny to me. I find most of the times, most people who do heroic or even good things, a lot of time it's reluctant, not because they're bad people, but because they might be scared. They don't know if it's worth the risk. They don't want to get involved, but then they just can't help themselves, and that fascinates me.
Yeah, I think it changed his whole character because
Hmm.
in the beginning, yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, I didn't really like the little shit for the whole first thing, but
Oh, I don't blame you.
but as it goes on, it was that he actually engaged with people, and I thought that was
Mhm.
an interesting theme to say as you engage, he color. I mean, and the painting became anything more. People went from being just these faceless things he interacts with to being real humans to him,
Mhm.
and it was hard for him because he wasn't ready for it. So,
Mhm.
and in the end of it, I like your appreciation that there's nothing that self-important people hate more than being made to look ridiculous.
Of course.
Has
Yeah, it's you cannot take them down until you can first take them down,
yeah.
and like how they view themselves and stuff like that. I've
I'm
always
not
kind of believed that.
I'm not sure if it was your George Carlin that talked about punching down in comedy instead,
Yeah.
that people who like talk about the different groups and like, well, let's make fun of women, let's make fun of,
Hmm.
anything. It's the yeah, that's punching down instead of the women comedians that I enjoy are the ones that, I'm willing to mock myself and say I did this. Boy, was I an
Yeah.
idiot, and make you laugh with somebody rather than at somebody.
I agree. I think self-deprecation to me is far funnier, just
Yeah.
bottom line. But I also think punching up is far more. I just think it's more compelling. Like punch up, go at the higher, go at them because no one else is. Like there's something very almost cathartic about bullying a bully. I think.
Exactly.
I don't know if it's fully healthy to do that, but I don't care. I just think, but I agree with you. Punching down and you're going to pick on people or mock people that are already mocked and 99.9% of the time mocked without justification and mocked just simply because it's easy. It's lazy. It's cowardly to do that. And in the end, if you're in the world of comedy, it's not funny. And if you're in the world of drama, fiction, which whatever have you, I just think it's lazy. It's not interesting. Like, oh, we're gonna have this person from this other country going through struggles, and haha, let's make them look worse. I don't. I just find it lame.
True. All right, let's move on to wedlock.
Yep.
I got a feeling, that when saw that you had lived in Mexico City, I got a very sort of futuristic Mexico City girl from the hills. So
Mm.
am I crazy on that one, or was that very much the came from a cute small town high in the mountains where everything was beautiful, went downtown, and let's face it, in every large city, there's a whole lot of parts that just aren't that pretty.
Of course. No, 100%. There are some ugly parts in every city.
It's true.
Sorry.
And there are a lot of shocks to her system about ugliness. I mean, she's coming to the city, she's going to the school, she's going to the university, I mean, I get the feeling she had some dreams there.
She did. She wasn't from the mountains. It was these towns I've seen throughout Mexico and in different places in Latin America as well, mainly Mexico. Just these highway towns. There would be these little towns you would go through the highways because in Mexico, getting around, it's far easier to get around by buses. And not the stereotypical ones you see on every movie, the ones with the chickens and all that. That's ridiculous. I've honestly never been in a bus like that in a decade. And I've been all around that country. Their buses are better than the ones I take here in Toronto, to be honest. And they're cheap and they take you throughout the country. Everything goes by hours, never distance. You're never like, oh, 200 kilometers. Nope. It's how far is Oaxaca? 5 hours. So
Uh,
you get on these buses, and when you're taking these journeys, which the scenery and everything, because Mexico's so diverse. You go through mountain, jungle sometimes, beach, on the ocean, coast, everything. But one thing that was always consistent was these little highway towns where you'd see a collection of restaurants, you'd see some homes behind them, and there was always just a sense that they were like oases, but not in a glorious manner. And I always would look at these towns that the highways would always cut in half, and then you would pass through it in maybe 10, 20 seconds, and then it'd be gone. And just wondering, like, if people live here, but they're not connected to anything. And so that was where she was from, the main character. She was just from one of those towns.
Right. And giving away a little bit of, there's questions that I had for myself of what kind of a crappy self-worth does it take for a girl to let her marry her and put off her schooling after knowing her for a week? And
Right.
I kept thinking that is a society-wide lack of valuation for her mind and her education and what she can contribute to the society.
hmm Well, a lot of it was like a lot of that character. Well, obviously, and you've read it, so there's obviously parts that aren't real, and thank God they're not real. But
Yes.
there's a lot of the traits that was in the character of Elena. I've seen, I've met. I would speak to a lot of women that have just been in bad relationships that really diminish their sense of value, self-worth, just relationships that were on the surface looked great, but underneath you could tell it was just stripping them. Like it was really corrosive. Like it's one thing to say toxic, but I found these types of relationships to be just corrosive, but very quietly and silently. You couldn't see it.
Yeah.
And then they would tell me about these relationships, and it had a lot to do with culture around the world, not just Mexico.
Not
But
just,
just no, absolutely not. I've a lot of it too is influenced by friends that I have here in Toronto and a lot of places. Just that notion of this, you meet this guy, and he just seems to provide everything, and like you're in a very vulnerable place, and he obviously senses that, and just takes you over. And so that it just I've seen it, so I wanted to portray it.
and I got to say, I liked the title. So I want to have a question. Did the book come first or did the title come first?
That title was actually a gift to me. When I first wrote this book has a long history. I first started it when I first moved to Mexico, actually, like 12 years ago. I wrote the very first draft, which wasn't that good, but the idea never really changed of the main, the hidden part that I know you know. And that stayed the same, but it kept growing over the years. I would put it aside and then I would go back to it, rewrite it, then put it aside and just keep going for that. But the title, it was originally I don't even remember the original title, to be honest. But a friend of mine, his name was Taylor, and he was visiting Mexico. And I told him, I'm looking for a title. He's like, how about Wedlock? I'm like, that's perfect.
Yeah.
So he gave me that title. Yep. So that title was a gift from a friend Taylor. hmm
It is, I gotta say, even Midwestern America, I know gals that married because their mothers, and if anybody doesn't understand the importance of your mother in your life, let me tell you how she's ruled it, no matter whether you like her or not. But that we're brought up thinking it's like, well, you have to get married. You have to have somebody taking care of you. You have this. I had a friend who's a type 1 diabetic. So she's like, Jeannie, I have to be married. What if I have and I tried to say to her, what if you get married and in 2 months he gets hit by a bus? That's my favorite. What if they get hit by a bus? Because the sudden shocking change of you will still be alone.
Yeah.
So why not build a community of friends and loving around you and assume that eventually maybe I'll probably be in some kind of communal home where you're never actually going to be alone. What is this illusion that we've created in so many places that you must have a partner? You must have somebody to take care of you.
Well, I think it's been established for generations. I mean, it goes back
Yeah.
hundreds of years, and it just goes back to that idea that I think, and to take it from where the story's located, Latin America and stuff like that, I mean, it goes back so far to like when the Spanish came and the conquest and everything like that. It was imported in a sense. And then it just kept growing, that idea that, yeah, without a man taking care of you, you can't make it. And you see it, and as much as it's patriarchal, but it's also passed down from mothers and grandmothers, and it's just I couldn't imagine
Oh,
Well, I
we
can,
are
but I
no one
try.
here is going to say anything that women have not participated fully in their own
Of
subjugation
course.
over the years. But
Of course. And like I can't imagine it and I try to express it, but that idea of just being a girl and you're getting it from both sides, your mother, your father, your brothers, your sisters, just almost everyone telling you you need this. Like almost like you can't make it on your own or without this. And like that sucks that because so many women can and they could probably do it so much better than they ever thought they could. But it's always so safer to play it where you just kind of go with this because you can see the status quo, you can see it, so you can be like, well, okay, there's precedence. But to go off on your own in certain, especially in certain cultures around the world or just environments, definitely class plays a huge part. It's easy to go off on your own if you're rich,
yeah,
but all of these factors play in, and I could only imagine how intimidating it must be. It was intimidating for me to go off on my own and see, I didn't go to college. I didn't want to. It didn't like it. I didn't want to do what everyone around me was doing, and I was terrified. I still am. And so to add in like being a woman and almost that gender requirement, so to speak, is just that must be a huge weight. And so I never judge women, girls, whomever, that, that weight just proves too heavy. I think it's irresponsible to judge them, especially without understanding why and how much pressure that must be to empathize with it. And that's what I tried to do with the main character. I always tried to empathize with her and also empathize with Diego, with the man too,
I think there's
because
empathy for both in this. And I
Mhm,
really liked that. I'm not a spoiler, but
mhm,
she does find agency.
mhm, mhm,
It's just is sort of as she stops just kind of being buried within her life and gets a little bit of perspective, a few breaths of distance, as it were, to really look at it and decide, what she
mhm,
wants and how she wants what she wants for herself. I think
mhm.
that's important.
And for him, for Diego, for me, it was important that he's not malicious. He's not. He really loves her. It's real. It's just corrupted.
Yeah.
It's just corrosive and toxic and all that. But he doesn't hate her. He's not a misogynist in the way people like the way it would be defined. He doesn't hate women.
He's
He
not a
just
conscious misogynist. Yes.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's a better way of putting it.
Yeah.
But he's also just reacting to his environment, to what he's seen. He's like, I just want to keep her safe. That's his mission. And in a way, he really thinks he's doing it.
And I feel for it's important to remember as we rise up and try to fight down issues of the patriarchy to say, if this story was from Diego's point of view, he would be the hero.
You
And
could, yeah.
and he is doing all that he has been taught is
hmm
good and important, and by the very definition of love, of his class and of his gender, and that's interesting to remember too.
And that was very important to me. It could have been so easy to paint him as just a mustache twirling villain or just an evil man, like the husband in Sleeping with the Enemy or something like
Right.
that. You know what I mean? That's easy to do. But
It did have a boxing Helena flavor. I'm not going to lie.
yeah. And but I wanted, because I've known guys like that too. And like they're not monsters in a way. Like they're just human beings, and he's just trying to interpret what he sees in a way that he thinks is right. He doesn't have much guidance, clearly.
Yeah.
And obviously this is not a man that's had much in the way of strong female influence. And so, I mean, that's like I was raised by a single mom. I mean, for me, I that's all I had, sometimes to my detriment. Where like so I kind of got that perspective growing up too, and I've known so many strong women in my life that would really tell me what they thought. So it gave me a lot of perspective. And on the other side too, I would listen to these types of guys. I would listen to them. It's so easy to just judge and be just like, you're awful, goodbye, you're whatever. But I would listen to them. Like, why do you think you need to do this? And they would give reasons that, while I don't agree and didn't agree with them, I get why they believed it. And in a way, I just don't like the idea that to try to understand something gets misinterpreted as condoning it, as almost like agreeing with it. And I don't know. I just like to understand things. Even if I don't agree or hate it, I still want to understand it.
Yeah.
because then at least I can explore it. And I always tried to do that with my work.
It sounds like that's some, would that be your advice for young would-be writers then?
Absolutely. You always hear be a great reader, and I agree with that 100%. If you want to be a great writer, you must read, and you must read like a bodybuilder exercises, 100%. But I think you should also be a good listener and not just listen to people in an echo chamber who agree with you. Don't do that. Listen to people that you don't agree with. As long as they're not aggressive and they're just like insulting or hateful, listen to them. Like, listen to people with views that you find repugnant. Even if they're willing to have a mature conversation about it, that's a wealth of knowledge, because there's so many people who think this way. You can't just dismiss them. I don't agree with them, so they're bad and I won't. Well, then you'll never understand them. It's almost like if this mentality is your enemy, so to speak, like the patriarchy and misogyny and all of these things that people hate, and for good reason, well, you need to understand it. If you really want to do something about it, you have and empathize with it and understand that you're not that superior to it. None of us are. Like, when you hear how people think this way, anybody could have easily made that turn to that based on experiences, traumas. We don't know. So I always try to listen as much as I can. And it can be challenging too. It's not easy. But
well, it's like looking at philosophy and view of the world as architecture. If you don't know where the flying buttresses are, how are you going to blow them up?
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. Yeah. You got to understand the foundations. You got to understand how this was built. Like a recent thing to me that is very interesting, particularly being in Toronto and San Francisco, I'm sure you can relate. Like, when you're in places that are incredibly diverse, multicultural, which I love, wealth of knowledge. Love it. And a big thing that I always wanted to learn and study, colonialism and such. But I found that it's becoming increasingly harder to have a discussion about it versus just colonialism. It's evil. Okay, cool. And it is. I agree. But understand it. Understand what was happening at the time. Understand why they did it. Understand the psychology behind. Almost empathize with it. But understanding that empathy does not mean agreeing.
It does not mean sympathy. It just means sympathy.
Not at all.
Exactly.
You're just putting yourself in their shoes and seeing it from their perspective. It does not mean you condone it. It does not mean you would do. No, not at all. And I always try to stress that. And for young writers and storytellers, I think it's a good mentality to have, that empathize with even the most vile and empathize equally with the most noble. Empathize with them all. Understand where they're coming from. And that's how you can create characters that are flawed, that have plenty of nuance, and those interesting things that really great stories possess, I think.
I think you're absolutely correct on that. And we will put links to Jonathan's site and books that were mentioned on this podcast on our own website, which is www.writersdrinkingcoffee.com. Jonathan, thank you so much for visiting with me today. This was fun.
Thank you very much, Jeannie. I had a great time.
So everybody, you absolutely have to go out and try Wedlock. Check out some of his other books out there. You will see the links on our webpage. And best of wishes with all your future writing.
Thank you very much. And hopefully maybe in the future I can return.
Well, I look forward to it.
All right. Take care.
You too. You've been listening to Writers Drinking Coffee, a labor of love and enthusiasm put together by the hosts. Our main web support magic is brought to you by Deirdre Schween, and our sound engineer and backup web spiders are David Welsh and John Schmidt. Our intro music is Pretty Maid Milking the Cow, and our exit music is Breakfast with the Morning Person, both by Michael Langberg. You can hear more from Michael Langberg on manyhatsmusic.com. Our podcast sponsors are Jackal Designs, The Bean Scenes, and Arm Street in Ukraine. And hey, thanks for listening.